Number 51, Intertestament Period and Matthew, in the series The Picture of God in All 66 by Graham Maxwell, recorded March 1982.
Now tonight, the book of Matthew, and that means next week, Mark. I thought we shouldn't hurry with the Gospels. Sometimes we've done Luke and Acts together because Luke wrote both. In fact, Luke may have written slightly more of the New Testament than Paul. It's almost a tie. And between them, a minister and a physician wrote almost the entire New Testament. There isn't much left after you take the epistles of Paul and Luke and Acts. But I think to grant us more time on the life of Christ, let's just do Matthew, Mark, Luke, John. And then we'll try to tie Acts together with Luke when we get to it. And the question we ended with last time, looking forward to entering the New Testament, was this. How could it be, in the light of all the anticipations of the Old Testament, in spite of all the sins and failures and disappointments of God's people, how could it be that after the Babylonian discipline and the great revival and Reformation too that occurred under Ezra and Nehemiah, how could it be that 4 centuries later, when the Messiah actually came, he was so violently opposed and so seriously misunderstood? Although had he arrived in the days of Malachi, might he have been misunderstood? Or in the days of Isaiah or any of the other writers, as far as that's concerned. But I think it is significant to look at the period between the Testaments and see if there's any evidence there. Taking one of Ellen White's comments, for example, in Desire of Ages, as to why the Jews were disappointed. She says on page 700 of, just picking one place, the Jews were looking for a Messiah to be revealed in outward show. They expected him, by one flash of overmastering will, to change the current in men's thoughts and force from them an acknowledgement of his supremacy. See, that's the picture they had of God, that he would do this. But now, look what difficulty this caused for the Son of God himself. Thus, when Christ was treated with contempt, there came to him a strong temptation to manifest his divine character, because that's what they wanted to see. By a word, by a look, he could compel his persecutors to confess that he was Lord above kings and rulers, priests and temple. Not that they were converted, but they could hardly resist that show of force. But it was his difficult task to keep to the position he had chosen as one with humanity. So he realized he was faced with this problem. He knew he was not appearing to be the Messiah that they were anticipating, and how very disappointing that was. So something had happened, perhaps between the Testaments, to even worsen the picture of God and the picture of the coming Messiah between the Old Testament and the New Testament. So taking a look at this period, is there any record that we can look at that would tell us what had happened? We do know historically that when we leave the Old Testament, the Jews who returned to Palestine and did rebuild the temple, though they cried when they saw it compared with the old one, and they did rebuild the walls of Jerusalem, and they did say from now on the Bible and the Bible only and so on. At that time they were under the empire of the Persians, and then they came under the control of the Greeks, and then under the government of the Romans. They never were fully free again, were they? And when Jesus came, they still were under the rule of the Romans.
It says there that some of the time they were quite independent of all the other countries around them.
Well, they acted that way, but they didn't get away with it very much of the time.
They were free from the other countries.
Well, I'm going to mention one time.
The Maccabees...
That's the one I have on my list, and you're right. Good for you.
Quite a bit of the Maccabees, they were
yes.
An independent nation.
Well, we'll consider in a moment how free they really were. You mentioned now the struggle under Antiochus Epiphanes, which is worth mentioning. But in about 168 BC, the Greek ruler to the north of them came down and sought to bring the Jews under a greater measure of control, and he was very successful. He even went into the sanctuary and sacrificed swine's flesh on the altar, sought to destroy copies of the Old Testament and so on. And a 3.5-year battle ensued against Antiochus Epiphanes, sometimes called Antiochus Epimanes, the mad one. And eventually there rose a leader among the Jews whose name was Judas Maccabeus. Because he was victorious against Antiochus Epiphanes, they thought of him almost as a Messiah, who did you see what they wanted. He led them to victory over their enemies. And it is true, and the whole story is very interesting and told partly in the Apocrypha. He did overcome Antiochus, and he came back and he cleansed the sanctuary. And this is why some people see the cleansing of the sanctuary in Daniel 8 as pertaining to what Judas Maccabeus did after his victory over Antiochus Epiphanes. And not to get into this too much, we did touch on it in Daniel, you remember? This cleansing of the sanctuary was celebrated by the Feast of Dedication right down to the time of Christ. And it is true that war lasted for 3.5 years. And there were 360 days to a year, and 3.5 times 360 is 1,260, and some say, well, that's the 1,260 days, which is almost half of 2,300. And this is why many scholars see the victory over Antiochus Epiphanes and his previous tyranny the fulfillment of some of the prophecies of the book of Daniel. But anyway, the Jews had been under the government of these empires, more or less. At times they asserted their freedom as much as they could. Then the Herods arose as their kings. The Herods were descended from Jacob or Esau. The Edomites, they were from Esau, which must have been hard for the descendants of Esau to accept, of Jacob, that the descendants of Esau should be in power. By the time we come to the appearance of Christ on this earth, there had developed during this period a number of sects, groups. The Pharisees, for example, had now developed. They were perhaps the most conservative group in a balanced way. They were quite opposed to worldly Greek Hellenistic influences. But they made great use of Scripture. These were the ones, though, who were the most careful to follow Scripture, apparently caused Jesus the greatest difficulty. Then there were the Sadducees, who had come under more influence of Greek philosophy and Greek thought and Greek culture. They were inclined to reject some of the beliefs of the Pharisees. For example, they did not believe in the resurrection. And that's why Paul, when he stood before the Sanhedrin, I don't know whether it was a stroke of inspiration or what led him to do this, he said, "It is with respect to the resurrection that I am called here today." And he knew that would divide the council, and they fought it out with each other, the Pharisees and the Sadducees together. But there were other groups. There were the Essenes, who've been famous since the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls. They thought the Pharisees were much too lax. And they were far more scrupulous in their Sabbath observance even than a Pharisee. In fact, you should read the record of how very, very careful they were. They were even inclined to believe that one should not relieve himself on the Sabbath, which meant that the preparation day had to be very carefully observed. And then there were the Zealots, who felt that none of these others were doing enough. They were the activists. They felt that God's people should become involved in politics, and they were the ones who really wanted to move against the Romans and set God's people free. And of course, in this time, the synagogue and its services developed. And of course, the Jews were scattered all over the Mediterranean world. There was the great dispersion, or the great diaspora, as it was called. Some have estimated there were more Jews in Alexandria or down in Egypt than there were in Palestine in the time of Christ. And it was among these people that the Old Testament was translated into Greek, giving us the so-called Septuagint, the translation according to the 70. For the legend was that to get an accurate translation, 70 translators were put in 70 separate cells, and when they had completed their translations, all 70 were identical. So it's called the translation according to the 70, or the Septuagint. And the Sanhedrin had developed. that august group to which Paul was admitted when he was still Saul at an early age. But also during this period, there was a literature that you pointed to right there. There were the books later called the Apocrypha, and beyond that, books later called the Pseudepigrapha. And there were the books of rules known as the Mishnah, and there were the explanations of Scripture, the Targums, and other rules and regulations in the Talmud. And we should look at these in a moment. There may have been many other books, but these have come down to us. In fact, some of these have found their place in Roman Catholic editions of the Bible. And there's a reason for that, because the Roman Catholic Bible, which not always, but traditionally came from the Latin, came in turn not from the Greek and Hebrew, but from the Greek Septuagint of the Old Testament and the Greek of the New. And it was in the Septuagint that these extra books first made their appearance. And so it became a long tradition that these extra books belonged in the Bible. Temptation is to say too much about this before we get into Matthew. It's a long and colorful history, this period between the Testaments. But I brought a few of these along to show you the kinds of things that were available to some of the Jews in the times of Christ. Take, for example, the books that we call the Apocrypha. This is the best critical edition of the Apocrypha, put out by Oxford University. You can have much smaller copies of the Apocrypha. For example, in your New English Bible, right in the middle there. Oh, this is separate. You've got the separate volume. Yes. You can have it just like this if you like. Now, if you want a much smaller one, get the Apocrypha of the King James Version. It's in a very small printing. Or if you like, you can get the New English Bible with the Old Testament, the Apocrypha, and the New Testament. Or you can get the Revised Standard Version that way. You can get the King James Version that way. With the Apocrypha in the middle. Yes. Oh, I did at the beginning of the year, didn't I? Bring the King James along. And in the middle were the books of the Apocrypha. They were always there. And the printers were forbidden to leave them out for many years. Oh, very definitely. See, Catholic versions of the Bible always contain the Apocrypha. Who's using the Jerusalem? Maybe. They're in there, of course. Now, how these books became named apocryphal? Around 400 A.D., after Christ, when the Latin Bible was being circulated in many, many different versions with all kinds of differences between them, Pope Damasus asked Hieronymus, Jerome, to revise the Latin Bible. And being a very thorough scholar, he felt he ought to go to Palestine and learn Hebrew and translate from the original, or revise from the original. When he got there, he came in contact with the traditional Jewish 39 books of the Old Testament. By the way, they didn't count them as 39, we do. And he discovered that these books that we call extra books, not extra to a Catholic, these extra books were not in there. And it led him to re-examine them. And he came to the conclusion that these 14 books were inferior to the 39. And he preferred to leave them out, but tradition was so firmly fixed. You know how it is with people after several hundred years. They couldn't bear to hear of his leaving them out. So he at least called them hidden books. And that's what Apocrypha means. The opposite of Apocrypha is Apocalypse, by the way, the last book in the Bible, Revelation. These books he called hidden rather than revealed. And he refused to improve the revision, and that's the way they've remained in the Catholic Bible to this day. Luther, by the way, was the first to pluck them out and put them in the middle, because when the Apocrypha first appeared, it was scattered in with the other books. So when I say 14, it depends how you count them. 4 of them are in the book of Daniel. There's the Song of the Three Hebrew Worthies. We touched on this when we were in Daniel. There's the story of Susanna, the story of Bel, and the story of the dragon. So when you're with a Roman Catholic and you ask him to take out these extra books, you cause him considerable difficulty if you were to take a pair of scissors and do it, because you would lose the back side of these pages. For example, if you were to clean up Daniel, you'd lose part of Daniel 4, and you'd lose the first part of Hosea if they cut the pages out. But these books are books like the Maccabees and Tobit and Judith and Ecclesiasticus and the Wisdom of Solomon and the Prayer of Manasseh and these additions to Daniel and so on. But you'll notice the bigger volume is this one. These are the rest of the books that claim to be biblical, which are not in the Roman Catholic Bible. These are apocryphal, but are known as the Pseudepigrapha. These were also circulating at that time. And some of these books are extremely interesting. There's the Book of Jubilees, the Letter of Aristeas, the books of Adam and Eve, the Martyrdom of Isaiah. That's a book that tells how Isaiah was put in a hollow log and sawn in half by King Manasseh. True or false? Well, Prophets and Kings touches on it. If you want to read all the details, they're in this apocryphal pseudepigraphical book. Pseudepigrapha, you can see the two parts. Pseud is false, and epigraph is a title. These are falsely entitled books, like the next one, First Enoch. It claims to have been written by Enoch. But you ought to read that. In there, it says, Enoch, the seventh from Adam, prophesied the Lord would come with 10,000 of his saints and so on, and you'd think you were reading the New Testament. Does that mean that the New Testament quotes the Apocrypha, or both writers knew of this old tradition as to what Enoch said, and it was passed over many a back fence? There's the testaments of the 12 patriarchs, the Sibylline oracles, the Assumption of Moses. It's a book that tells the story of how Christ came back to resurrect Moses and take him to heaven. The Assumption of Moses. True or false? All right. Then several others. The Psalms of Solomon. Here's where there are a lot of extra psalms. Pirkei Avot, the story of Ahikar, the fragments of a Zadokite work, and so on. Now, those aren't known very much. And while we're talking about Apocrypha, the least known are the Apocryphal New Testament books. See, there's not only Apocryphal Old Testament, but Apocryphal New Testament. Now, these were written after Christ. But in here we have Apocryphal Gospels, Apocryphal Epistles, Apocryphal Acts, and Apocryphal Revelations. And these in turn help us to understand the thinking of the early Christians and how it is that the Christian church developed the way it did through the years. While this doesn't belong between the testaments, the value is the same. If we read these apocryphal and pseudepigraphical books written largely between the testaments, we have some information as to the thinking of God's professed people at that time as they anticipated the coming of the Messiah. And the picture is different. Some of the theology is quite different. For example, in 2 Maccabees it says, "It is a holy and wholesome thought to pray for the dead, that they may be relieved of their sins." It teaches prayers for the dead. Now, that's a key text for our Roman Catholic friends, and when President Kennedy died, I remember hearing Cardinal Cushing praying on the authority of that verse that President Kennedy's soul would be moved to eternal bliss with expedition, because a Catholic has to pass through the purifying experiences of purgatory on the way. It also teaches that the giving of alms atones for sin, that a boy who is charitable toward his father will atone for his sins, and ideas like this that are present. But most of all, it's the picture of God that's reflected in the Apocrypha and in the Pseudepigrapha that helps us understand why Jesus, when he came, was not the Messiah they wanted. He did not present the picture of God that they believed in, and his refusal to use force, but rather just to be persuasive and teach the truth in love. He wouldn't even perform miracles to attract their attention. That was not his purpose. They always had a meaning. This disappointed even his closest followers. Well, then when you turn to the New Testament Apocrypha, you can see how some of these same ideas that Jesus sought to correct were perpetuated right on through the early Christian centuries and do right down to the present time. For example, in these apocryphal Gospels, many details of Jesus' childhood that we'd like to know about are spelled out in some detail. One day it says that Jesus was playing with his friends, and one of them bumped him on the shoulder. Although one other manuscript says a boy threw a stone and hit him on the shoulder. See, these were copied enough. We even have different manuscripts of the Apocryphal New Testament Gospels. And Jesus turned and cursed his playmate, and he died. And the villagers came to Joseph and Mary and besought them to move to some other community because they said, "We do not want this violent child in our town." Now, how does that fit in? Another day, it was Sabbath, and Jesus was playing down by the river, and he was shaping little birds, little pigeons, with his hands out of the clay. And one of the boys ran home to tell Joseph, "Do you know what Jesus is doing? He's breaking the Sabbath." And Joseph came running down and said, "Son, how could you do this to us?" And Jesus clapped his hands, and the birds flew away, chirping as they went. And there were early Christians who thought, that's just lovely. They saw no problem with that kind of story. Another time, Jesus was building a house with his father, and they came to the last rafter, and it was too short. And wood would be scarce and expensive. And Joseph was greatly distressed. But Jesus said, "Be of good faith, my father, take the other end." And Jesus took this end, and they pulled and stretched it till it was the right length and hammered it into place. Many interesting stories of his childhood like that. Then you turn over to the Apocryphal Acts. There were 5 Apocryphal Acts that many early Christians preferred, because in Dr. Luke's Acts, Christ is much too, or the Bible is much too respectful toward women and toward marriage. That shows up in his gospel stories too. So Luke Acts was not popular with many early Christians. So there were 5 Apocryphal Acts that were preferred. And in these, the apostles are described as conducting evangelistic tours around the Mediterranean, very frequently described as separating husbands from their wives. There's an extraordinary story of a couple who had just got married, and they had gone on their honeymoon, and this was their first night, and the Lord appeared to them and told them that they really should not go through with that dastardly act. And they resolved that they would not, and they lived celibate lives from then on, lives of great victory and spirituality. And that was very popular among many early Christians as asceticism began to arise. But then there are very extraordinary stories. There's the story of how Peter actually made a camel go through the eye of a needle. And since this pertains to one of the gospel stories, it might be worth telling now. Because sometimes there's an argument as to whether it was a real needle. You remember in the story, it is easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than for a rich man to be saved. And how could a camel go through the eye of a needle? And so there are those who said that the eye of the needle is the little gate on either side of the main gate through the walls into Jerusalem. Now, archaeologists have never found any evidence that they call the little gates the eye of a needle. On the contrary, although in Christ's Object Lessons, have you seen the picture in the older editions of Christ's Object Lessons illustrating that story? Ellen White didn't pick the pictures, but it shows a camel approaching the little gate. And there's no way it can get through with all its load on its back. And so in the picture, it shows the owner removing the load from the back of the camel. See, that's worth 10 minutes of a good sermon, you can see. And then the camel is on his knees. That's worth 10 more minutes of the sermon. And then the owner has his rod raised in his hand. He's about to propel him through, and that's worth the appeal 10 minutes at the end of the sermon. And it's all wrong. Because that would mean if you tried hard enough, you could get through. And Jesus didn't say, well, with men this is very hard. He said, with men it is impossible. It's supposed to be a proverb of impossibility. So don't do what Lamster does and make it a rope. He says, well, the Aramaic for rope is very similar, and you don't want to make it possible for you to get through. If you try hard enough, that's defeating Christ's whole point. But the crowning evidence is that in the Apocryphal Acts, it tells how Peter was preaching, and a man came up at the end of a meeting and said, if I may perform a miracle, a certain miracle, I will be converted and give, I think it was 1,000 pieces of gold to support your ministry. And Peter said to him, what is the miracle? He said, if you'll make a camel go through the eye of a needle, then I will be converted and I'll give 1,000 pieces of gold to support your work. Well, if you use this translation, there is a more modern one which doesn't sound quite so biblical. This one that I have here is also Oxford University, and it's in King James English, which makes it sound quite biblical, which maybe is hazardous at times. Peter raised his eyes heavenward and said, Lord, thou hast entrapped us by thy words. But his faith was strengthened, and he said to the man, bring hither a needle and a camel. And Peter's followers rushed off to find the biggest needle they could, and they brought a big tent maker's needle. Now, in the Gospels, you will find both tent maker's needle and a surgeon's needle. Guess which one has surgeon's needle? That's Luke, naturally, you see. Well, they came with the tent maker's needle, and Peter said, O ye of little faith, bring hither a surgeon's needle. So they got a little one, and he stuck it in the ground. Meanwhile, the man really didn't have his heart in this, so he had taken out some insurance. And he had arranged with a woman of dubious reputation in the town to ride on the back of the camel. And then as double insurance, he got a huge piece of pork and hung it on the side and relaxed. But Peter's faith was great, and he commanded the camel and the prostitute and the pork to pass through the eye of the needle. And the camel and the woman and the pork approached, and to the man's horror, the eye of the needle began to swell, bigger and bigger, and the camel and the woman and the pork passed through, and for good measure turned around and passed back the other way. And Peter said, now are you ready to be converted, and how about that gold? And the man said, well, not quite so fast. If I can perform the miracle, then I'll be converted and give you everything that I have. And Peter said, well, be it unto you according to your faith. And with quivering voice, the man commanded the camel to pass through the eye of the needle. And the camel and the woman and the pork approached. And to the man's horror, the eye opened up once again. And the camel and the woman started through, but stuck in the middle. Oh, he turned to Peter and said, what shall I do? Pray for me. And Peter prayed, and the man's faith was strengthened. And the camel and the woman and the pork passed through. 1,000 souls were converted that day, and he gave all his money to support Peter's ministry. How do you like that kind of a story? Very popular, though, with many who just love miracle stories like that. Of course, if we had a Sabbath school lesson quarterly on these stories, one after the other, I almost think attendance would pick up. Because when you turn over the page, you come to the story of John and the Bedbugs. Believe now, early Christians, some preferred this kind of story. John was itinerating with his followers, and he put up in an inn for the night, and as his followers got into their beds, they quickly jumped out again and said, John, there are bugs in the beds. And it says here that John stood upon his bed, and he said, O ye little creatures, I command ye, that ye should leave the servants of the Lord alone. And he went and opened the door, and there was a scurrying and a bustling in the beds, and out came all the bedbugs, and they went out the door. He closed it, and they addressed themselves to sleep. In the morning they arose, prepared themselves for the journey, and just before they left, John said, 1 minute. And he opened the door, and there in neat rows outside were all the bedbugs. And he turned to his followers and said, Oh, you see how the little creatures are obedient unto our word. Would that we were all as obedient unto the word of the Lord. And then he said to the little bedbugs, since you have been so obedient, you may now return unto your several places. And there was a scurrying and a bustling, and all the bugs went back into the beds. Well, these are great stories you can tell, and it stirs great interest. Again, I say, can you imagine a Sabbath school lesson quarterly on these? In another one, Peter was conducting meetings in Rome. Do you remember Simon Magus, who tried to buy the Holy Spirit? Well, he was always competing with Peter. And to win people to come to his meetings, Simon stunned the crowds in Rome by flying over the city. Well, you can imagine if one of our evangelists tried this, attendance might pick up. And Simon Peter, not Simon Magus, Simon Peter prayed that Simon Magus would fall down and break his leg. And in answer to his prayer, Simon fell out of the skies and broke his leg in 3 places. Well, some thank the Lord for these wonderful manifestations of his power. Well, then we come to the Apocryphal Letters. By the way, it's in these that we have the descriptions of Paul that are sometimes used. Paul, a man little of stature, thin-haired upon the head, crooked in the legs, of good state of body, with eyebrows joining, and nose somewhat hooked, full of grace. For sometimes he appeared like a man, and sometimes he had the face of an angel, and so on. These are all in the Apocrypha, and some of them are passed along as being true. Oh, it also tells in here of how when the Christians were arrested and were being taken into the Colosseum to be killed, Peter once again was afraid, and he ran for his life down the Appian Way. And as he fled, he met a familiar hooded figure. And Peter said to the familiar hooded figure, in Latin, Quo vadis? That is, where goest thou? And that's the basis for the film, Quo vadis, which is based on the book, Quo vadis? Where goest thou? And the hooded figure said, I am going into Rome to be crucified once again in your behalf. And Peter said, no, Lord, not again. And he went back and gave himself up. And he was taken into the Colosseum to be crucified. And he stood before the cross and said, I am not worthy to be crucified as was my Lord. Crucify me upside down. And so he was. True or false? Isn't that interesting? See, there's gems of truth behind these stories, but a lot of legends have crept around them. John was thrown into a cauldron of boiling oil. These stories are all in here. But then there are apocryphal letters. Did you know Jesus and King Abgar had a correspondence? How valuable if you could find those letters. And then you come to the apocryphal revelations, the revelation of St. Peter, the first Christian description of hell. It goes back much further than many suppose. Dante didn't think up this whole inferno idea. But Peter, this is apocryphal, remember, and it's pseudepigraphical. Peter never wrote it. But some early Christians believed that Peter had. And you should read what happens to you when you go to this kind of a hell. It teaches that each person is tortured precisely with respect to the sins that had dominated his life. For example, if your sin was primarily a failure to tell the truth, then you might be hung by your tongue over a hot flame. If perchance it was some other organ of the body that had been the instrument of sin and indulgence, then it was appropriately tortured for the rest of eternity. And you can just imagine how this is all spelled out. Well, this, to many early Christians, was Bible. And one needs to know this if one wants to know why the early Christian church took off in the directions that it did. For many preferred some of these books to the 27 books of the New Testament. And you can see the difference very clearly. Someday, if you ever have the time, you might want to read, we're doing 66 over a period of 9 months. If you could take maybe 9 days or less and read Genesis through Malachi, and then Esdras through Maccabees, and Jubilees through the story of Ahikah, the end of the pseudepigrapha, then Matthew through Revelation, and then the apocryphal Gospels through the Acts and the Epistles to the revelation of St. Peter, and get there before you've forgotten everything before. And then decide for yourself. That convinced me most. The 66 stand in a class by themselves. It's not that they're without problems. We've discussed those. But there is a different spirit behind these other books. Some are more useful and valuable than others, like the Maccabees. One of them is rather good history of the period. Anybody have a question, by the way, about those extra books? Yes?
So you sort of led us to believe that there is some truth in some of these
books. That's right.
I'd be afraid to read it because I wouldn't know which is which.
Well, if you were full of the 66, then it would be safe to read these others. You know, I don't want to prejudice you in that way. Some people have accepted the invitation and sat down and done this over a long weekend. I remember one time up at PUC, there was a student whose home was in Hawaii. In fact, it was Elder Oshita's son. He was a Bible teacher at Hawaiian Mission Academy. Some of you may have known him. And Gordon was in one of my classes. He said, I can't go home for Thanksgiving. I'm going to do this. So he sat down on a Wednesday with this big pile of books, and he started out. Next Monday morning in Greek class, he said, I did it. I read it all the way through. And the 66 are different. It's true. So if you don't want to take someone else's word for it, sometime you might want to sit down and read it all the way through. It's fascinating reading. But particularly for our purposes, it helps us to understand why there was this misunderstanding of what Jesus came to say, and this opposition to his picture of God and the nature of the kingdom and so on. This is the background for it, yes.
How about Josephus? Is that a good...
Yes, that pertains to this period too, between the Testaments and right through the life of Christ. In fact, he is supposed to have borne witness to Christ. It's called the Testimonium Flavianum, Flavius Josephus' testimony. However, not many treat it too seriously among scholars because only Christians preserve the writings of Josephus, and it's thought that they put it in maybe. So we don't need it to make the point. Maybe he did say that or not. It's thought that he was a very colorful and imaginative writer of history. So, but you can't ignore a document. We have so few from that period. Yes, it's good to read what he had to say. Yes.
Does it mention anything about Sabbath keeping in these books? I noticed the Catholics take
Yes, see, the Catholics have never denied the fourth commandment at all, and the Decalogue reads exactly the same in a Roman Catholic version. It's in the Catechism only that they have these other comments. But since you've mentioned it, from this same period there developed the multitudinous rules and regulations that the Jews, in their concern to obey God's commandments, developed down to the last detail. And one of the famous collections of these is known as the Mishnah, which you can get in this very good translation. I see it's Oxford University again. You should read all the rules in this one volume. You could put a lot of rules in a volume that size. For example, the rules for Sabbath keeping, since you've mentioned Sabbath. The fourth commandment is quite stunning. Remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. In it thou shalt not do any work. And it does not specify what work is. Now there's a trusting thing for our God to say to us. Well, this was not enough for those who after the days of Ezra were absolutely committed to obeying God, for they realized they had not before. And from now on they were going to keep the Sabbath very holy. So the leaders, the religious leaders and theologians among the Jews, undertook to spell out Sabbath work. For example, the main classes of work are 40 save one. There are 39 kinds of work. I'll read some of them. Sowing, plowing, reaping, binding sheaves, threshing, winnowing, cleansing crops, grinding, sifting, kneading, baking, shearing wool, washing or beating or dyeing it, spinning, weaving, making two loops, weaving two threads, separating two threads, tying a knot, loosening a knot, sewing two stitches, tearing in order to sew two stitches, hunting a gazelle, slaughtering or flaying or salting it or curing its skin, scraping it or cutting it up, writing two letters. I'll look up several of those in a moment that we've mentioned. Erasing in order to write two letters, building, pulling down, putting out a fire, lighting a fire, striking with a hammer, and taking out aught from one domain into another. These are the main classes of work, 40 save one. Now, the rest of this first large section spells out these details. For example, if a man took out aught in his right hand or in his left hand, in his bosom or on his shoulder, he is culpable, he is guilty. For this last was the manner of carrying of the sons of Kohath. If he took it out on the back of his hand, or with his foot, or with his mouth, or with his elbow, or in his ear, or in his hair, or in his wallet, carried mouth downwards, or between his wallet and his shirt, or in the hem of his shirt, or in his shoe, or in his sandal, he is not guilty, since he has not taken it out after the fashion of them that take out a burden. Now remember that, next Sabbath, you see. Now, it sounds amusing to us, but what if you believed this was the blueprint? You see, this was done in all sincerity. And Jesus spoke to an audience who took this very, very seriously. And you remember what he did on Sabbath? Concerning which command did he get into the most trouble? But with respect to the Sabbath. Oh, let me pick another one here. About the two letters. He is culpable that writes two letters, whether with his right hand or with his left, whether the same or different letters, whether in different inks or in any language. They have declared culpable the writing of two letters only by reason of their use as a mark, for so used they to write on the boards of the tabernacle, that they might know which adjoined which, and so on. Two letters. Let me go on to another one. What if you're having dental discomforts on the Sabbath? If a man's teeth pain him, he may not suck vinegar through them, but he may take vinegar after his usual fashion, and if he is healed, he is healed. If his loins pain him, he may not rub thereon wine or vinegar, yet he may anoint them with oil, but not with rose oil. Now king's children may anoint their wounds with rose oil, since it is their custom so to do on ordinary days, and so on. There are knots for which they that tie them on the Sabbath are accounted culpable, camel drivers' knots and sailors' knots. And as a man is culpable through the tying of them, so he is culpable through the untying of them. But none is accounted culpable because of any knot which can be untied with one hand. So you must know your knots. You boy and girl scouts would be ahead. If a Gentile came to put out the fire, they may not say to him, "Put it out," or "Do not put it out," since they are not answerable for his keeping Sabbath. But if it was a minor that came to put it out, they may not permit him, since they are answerable for his keeping Sabbath. So you'd want to check the age very carefully of individuals you're dealing with. If a man bathed in the water of a cave or in the water of Tiberias and dried himself, even though it was with 10 towels, he may not bring them away in his hand. Why not? Footnote. From fear of offending against the principle of squeezing out, however little of the moisture in them. So if you just carried them, you might squeeze out some moisture. But if 10 men dried themselves with 1 towel, which would be difficult, wiping their faces, their hands, and their feet, they may bring the towel away in their hands, footnote, because so many would keep each other warned of the danger of squeezing. You'd have to watch that with great care. Now, just one more about the Sabbath. If on the eve of the Sabbath darkness overtook a man while he was on the way, he must give his purse to a Gentile. And if there was no Gentile with him, he must put it on the ass. When he has reached the outermost courtyard of the town, he may take off from the ass such baggage as can be taken off on the Sabbath. And for what cannot be taken off on the Sabbath, he may loosen the cords so that the sacks fall down of themselves. And you might lose your donkey that way, unless a Gentile should come by and take pity on the animal and remove the load. But you may not ask him to do it. But if he should choose to do it, that's not your business. Of course, if in any way you were wringing your hands in front of your donkey, and that might win the sympathy of the Gentile, then you have in a way asked him to do it. So here you are with your donkey, and the load did not fall off. What are you going to do? For here comes a Gentile. He could take the load off, but you may not ask him. And so the Gentile comes over and removes it, and you think to yourself all the rest of the way, I wonder if in any way at all I led the Gentile to do it, in which case I've sinned. Wouldn't you be worrying all the time if you sinned? And Jesus said, you lay burdens on people that are heavy to bear. They never knew whether they were keeping the law or not. He said, my yoke is easy and my burden is light, and he got into trouble for talking like that, as is evidenced right away in Matthew. Yes?
Place where this stopped in 400 AD, but I couldn't find when the origin of the Mishnah.
Well, many of those rules, still prevail, but they're modernized. I'll give you an illustration.
Approximate time when this Mishnah was started. Who started it, or what was the origin of it?
These things develop over a long period of time, like the Talmud and so on. And I doubt it. Although, you see, Nehemiah said those gates must be locked on the Sabbath. And if you tradesmen come out there one more time, I'll lay hands on you. So you see, that idea prevailed. You remember Jesus said, pray that your flight be not in the winter or on a Sabbath day. And we sometimes say that's a good argument for keeping the Sabbath. I don't think so. It's rather the gates were locked on Sabbath. It'd be a bad day to escape, that's all. We don't need that text for the keeping of the seventh-day Sabbath. I don't think it's a good one to use. It would be more difficult to leave on the Sabbath than on any other day. In here, there's a good history of the gradual development of this. But the main thing is that the spirit of concern to do God's will in every detail produced a blueprint. We like to talk about a blueprint. And to this present day, some of these rules are followed. I didn't read the one about how far you can travel on the Sabbath. This is still followed, that a devout Jew can only go about a half a mile. However, what if you had 2 homes? Could you go half a mile to your summer home and still go another half a mile? And the answer is yes. Well, you want to visit Uncle Abraham, and Uncle Abraham lives just under a mile away. You cannot visit him on the Sabbath. If you had a summer home halfway, you could go to that one and then make it to Uncle Abraham's. Well, next question, what constitutes a summer home? How about lunch behind a rock, under a bush? And so they had ways of handling this, you see. You could go and have your lunch, and this is my summer home. A very simple home, to be sure, but then you make it to Uncle Abraham's. We smile, but you know, a lot of folks smile at our rules. You know, they really think some of our rules are funny. What impresses me is the absolute dedication here to do God's will down to the last detail, and they didn't leave any details out. Dr. Provancha found that every once in a while, when there was no rule, that it put some Jewish thinkers in a quandary. And when Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel was with us, he's dead now, and a very wonderful writer on the subject of the Sabbath, Dr. Provancha asked him a question in medical ethics. I forget which one it was, maybe therapeutic abortion or euthanasia or something like that. And Rabbi Heschel smiled and said, I cannot answer that. The fathers never wrote, the rabbis never wrote on that subject. You see, they have an answer to everything in the books. Can you see what a threat Jesus was when he came and did what he did on the Sabbath? I should have read the ones on healing. Well, you notice the one on the vinegar, you see. And for him to make that clay was like rolling up a cement mixer and making this clay and putting it on the man's eyes. And then to go and bathe, you know, it was all against the rules entirely.
There hasn't been much change for the Orthodox Jew even to this day.
Well, you remember at the funeral of President Sadat that Menachem Begin had to be housed nearby or he couldn't get to the funeral. You see, the rule is still followed. And I remember one time taking a group from Pacific Union College when I was still teaching there over to the synagogue in central Sacramento. And when we arrived on Friday evening, it was interesting. Here were all the saints parked outside the Adventist church, which was diagonally across the corner, parking their cars and going into the MV meeting. And we parked outside the synagogue and went in there instead. And there was plenty of parking outside the synagogue. Well, after a 3.5-hour service, which will undoubtedly be relevant to mention when we get to John 5:39, and I'll maybe save it till then, we went outside about 11:30. They don't have short services. It was a tremendous evening. And we commented to the rabbi on the wonderful attendance Friday night. We said, will they all be back tomorrow morning? He said, no, regrettably not. He said, they come Friday evening because the stores are closed anyway, but I'm afraid they will be in their stores, many of them on Sabbath morning. But some will come back. We commented on the absence of automobiles. Of course, the Adventist automobiles around the MV meeting had long since gone. They were just ours. In fact, he looked and said, I see you drove all the way from PUC. They would not permit that. Said, does your church allow that? They came just a short distance on foot from wherever they lived nearby to the synagogue. So the same carefulness prevails even now. But we do smile, and then I like to correct that for myself. These are people who want to be saved, and they believe they have to do this, and they're absolutely dedicated to this. I wish Rabbi Simmons was still here. I wish he'd get up right now and describe how seriously he has taken some of these rules. Very wonderfully. But Jesus ran into trouble over some of these issues as we turn now to Matthew. Matthew was written by a Jew. Many evidences that the writer was a Jew. He knew his Old Testament very well. You notice he uses the Old Testament many times in quotation. Some have estimated 60 times he quotes the Old Testament. Would that not be essential to a devout Jew? He also notes the fulfillment of prophecies and predictions to show that the Messiah, the Old Testament predicted, had now come. But those are worth looking at. Take a look at one or two of those. Look at Matthew 2:15. You remember, Jesus fled to Egypt. And then when Herod died, verse 14, he rose and took the child and his mother by night and departed to Egypt and remained there until the death of Herod. This was to fulfill what the Lord had spoken by the prophet, out of Egypt have I called my son. Now, where is that prediction? That's Hosea. And that's the famous chapter that we have read. And I very frequently like to read out loud, because that's where God says, how can I give you up? How can I let you go? But if you go back and read Hosea, it's all about the Exodus, isn't it? In Hosea 11, out of Egypt have I called my son. It doesn't seem like a prediction of the return of Jesus from Egypt. Then how could Matthew use it that way? Well, notice also 2:18. Rachel weeping for her children after the killing of the baby boys. And you look that up, that happened in Old Testament times. It doesn't look like a prediction, does it? So what does it mean this was to fulfill what had been said? Is it that Matthew saw very interesting parallels in there? Now, to underscore that approach, look at the prophecy of the virgin birth of Christ in 1:23. 22:23. All this took place following the long genealogy, which you notice goes back to Abraham. Would that not be appropriate? Writing to Jews, you see, to Abraham. Then there's mention of the birth of Jesus Christ, and this took place to fulfill what the Lord had spoken by the prophet. Behold, a virgin shall conceive and bear a son, and his name shall be called Emmanuel, which means God with us. Now, you remember when we read Isaiah? And Isaiah 7:14 refers to the baby born in the days of King Ahaz while Jerusalem was being besieged. And Isaiah said, before this baby is old enough to say, my father or my mother, Kings Rezin and Pekah will be driven off. It is not a prediction of the birth of Christ. Now, while it could well be young woman, and no doubt is in Isaiah 7:14, here where it says virgin, the Greek word means virgin. That's it, period. There's no question. Parthenos, virgin. And conceived of the Holy Spirit. No question. The baby in Isaiah 7 was conceived most likely of Isaiah, and the mother was Mrs. Isaiah. Do you remember, though, in Isaiah, that first there's mention of this baby that was born as a sign, Maher-shalal-Hashbaz. Remember the other brother, Shear-Jashub? He also was a sign. Isaiah said, my sons have been given as signs. Do you remember after that, you come to Isaiah 9, and a much more remarkable baby is born, whose name shall be called not Maher-shalal-Hashbaz, but Almighty God, Everlasting Father, Prince of Peace, Wonderful Counselor. That's not the son of Isaiah. So Isaiah himself saw a parallel here. And under inspiration, he first wrote of the baby to be born in those days as a sign that God was with them and the siege would be lifted. He went from that to the much more important event, now described in Matthew, when the Son of God would be born, conceived of the Holy Spirit, indeed of a virgin. And this was evidence God was with his people. So Matthew is following the thinking of Isaiah, who compares the two. Well, we've seen a lot of that in the Old Testament. So it seems that Matthew's consistent here when he sees significant parallels here. And in Isaiah, it is a prediction, definitely, when he draws the parallel. He refers to it. But I think with out of Egypt have I called my son, it would have to be something like this, that Matthew has told how when Herod died, Jesus came back. And he said, doesn't that remind you of Hosea? Out of Egypt have I called my son? An interesting parallel to a Jew who knew his Old Testament. Well, that's not the most important evidence, of course. It is categorically stated here that Jesus was born of Mary, and Joseph was not yet her husband, and she conceived of the Holy Spirit. It's spelled out in detail there, and we know that it was the Son of God. But the significant thing is that when Jesus began his ministry, his first sermon described got him into trouble right away. Look at Matthew 5. Isn't this his first formal presentation described there in the Gospels? So he arises, seeing the crowds, he went up onto the mountain, and when he sat down, his disciples came to him. The Sermon on the Mount, we call it. In the Gospel of Luke, it says he came to a level place, and some call it the Sermon on the Plain in Luke. If you look in Desire of Ages, Christ went up into the mountain, and seeing the people, he came down to this level place, and from there he spoke to the crowds, tying the two together. That's incidental. He opened his mouth and taught them, saying, Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. And he went on with the Beatitudes, and there aren't very many. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. and then commented on their being the salt of the earth and the light of the world, and he had to pause because he sensed that the reaction was unfavorable to what he was saying. And he had to say, "Think not that I've come to abolish the law and the prophets. I've come not to abolish them, but to fulfill them." And why would he need to say that in the middle of this presentation? Is it that what he had already said would not seem to be in harmony with the Old Testament? Now we need to pause on the meaning of law and the prophets. As you know, the Jews divided the Old Testament into 3 canons: the law, the prophets, and the writings, or the law, the prophets, and the Psalms. So that's the long name for the Old Testament, the law, the prophets, and the Psalms. Sometimes that was shortened to the law and the prophets, sometimes shortened to just the law. For example, Jesus, when they said, "You should not call yourself the Son of God," that's blasphemy, he said, "Does it not say in your law, ye are all gods, little g?" You know where that quote is? In the Psalms. So he called the Psalms the law. They knew what he was saying when he did this. Do you remember when, near the end of, it's in Luke though, isn't it? Jesus said, "Everything written about me in the law, the prophets, and the Psalms must be fulfilled." They knew he was referring to the 39 books of the Old Testament. So this isn't, "Think not that I've come to abolish the 10 Commandments." Now sometimes we use it as a key text like that. No, "Think not that I've come to abolish the whole Old Testament." I haven't. I've not come to abolish the Old Testament. I've come to fulfill it. Well, we think of fulfillment as fulfilling predictions. That's too limited. He had come to fulfill it in every appropriate way, like explaining it, telling them what it was all about, but they did not like his explanations. For example, number 1, "Blessed are the poor in spirit." They would not like that. They would not understand that. By the way, what is the meaning of poor in spirit? Does that mean lacking spirit, maybe? I didn't like that as a boy until I knew better. Blessed are those who are so old and tired they don't have much spirit. I like to think that Jesus died before he was 34, full of spirit. It can't be that. What do you have in your version for poor in spirit?
I have written in humble.
Oh, yes, and that's very good. What do others of you have? Poor in spirit? Yes. Blessed are those who are spiritually poor. Anybody have anything else? Way back in 1923, when Goodspeed came to this, you think how long ago that was? He translated, "Blessed are those who recognize their spiritual need, as I can do something for them," is the idea. Of course, Laodiceans do not recognize their spiritual need. They're just the opposite. Laodiceans do not heed the first of these Beatitudes. They're actually poor in spirit, but they don't think so. In Mount of Blessing, when Ellen White came to the first Beatitude, Mount of Blessing is the Mount of the Beatitudes, she has, "Blessed are those who recognize their spiritual need." It's remarkable how many times she did that. Do you remember, though, over in Luke, how the first Beatitude reads? It's not, "Blessed are the poor in spirit." Do you remember? Luke 6:20. He lifted up his eyes on the disciples and said, "Blessed are you poor." Now, how could they both be the same? Blessed are you poor, or blessed are you who recognize your spiritual need. Is it that poor people were more likely to recognize their spiritual need? Well, not always. And you know, blessed means happy. Happy are you poor? Well, what was the theology prevailing at that time? When a man was poor, was he blessed? No, the reason why he was poor was that he was not blessed. And why was he not blessed? Because he was not good. Do you remember in Job? So long as Job was prosperous, they knew he was a good man. But when he lost everything, the 3 theologians came and said, "You must have done something very bad. Because if you're good, you're blessed. If you're bad, you're punished." And the greatest evidence of blessing is prosperity. This is why Jesus so stunned them when he said, "It is easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than for a rich man to be saved." And they said, well, if a rich man can't be saved, who can be? Because if you're rich, you're blessed. And if you're blessed, you're good. So what Jesus said to them was, it is easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than for a good man to be saved. That's the way they read it. See, that's why they were so puzzled by it. But of course their theology was wrong, and the book of Job is to show it. Job was good, but he lost everything. And he remained good. But his friends had this system all neatly worked out, you see. The more virtuous you are, the more you're blessed. The more you're blessed, the more you're prospered. So the richer you are, the gooder you are. Well, hasn't that prevailed through the years? The rich can do no wrong, and so on. They're blessed, and they have tyrannized the poor sometimes because of this. But can you imagine Jesus saying, blessed are you poor? And they said, what do you mean we're blessed? We're poor because we're bad. Because if we were good, we'd be blessed, and if we were blessed, we'd be rich. So blessed are you poor? Happy are you poor? That made no sense at all. You see, his audience was more inclined to go with the three friends who came to Job. They preferred that theology. Jesus was siding more with Job. Can you imagine the reaction in the audience when Jesus would say, happy and blessed are you poor? Because, you see, the poor knew they were bad and recognized their spiritual need. And that's where Luke and Matthew do come together. You see, they really are saying the same thing because of their interpretation of poverty. If you were poor, you knew you were in need. You were not a good person, or you would be blessed. So Luke and Matthew, using different words, are saying the same thing. Blessed and happy are you who recognize your spiritual need. You're not Laodicean, you're not self-satisfied, you're not proud and self-righteous like the Pharisees. I can help you. Can you see that the very first thing he uttered in the sermon was heresy? It was regarded as not biblical. It was not in harmony with the Old Testament, that is, as they read it. So as he went on and said, you should even pray for your enemies and all those things, they said, this man doesn't even believe in the Old Testament. We're not supposed to do that. And he had to stop and say, I know some of you think I'm unbiblical at this point. Think not that I've come to abolish the Old Testament. I've not come to abolish it. I've come to fulfill it, to explain it, to tell you what it's all about. But they did not like his explanations. But the interesting question is, were his explanations already in the Old Testament? Look at some of them. For example, look at 5:21. Having said, I've come to support the Old Testament and explain it, he said, let me take up some more teachings of the Old Testament. Verse 21. You have heard that it was said to the men of old, you shall not kill. And the Greek is, you shall not murder. And whoever murders shall be liable to judgment. But I say to you that everyone who is angry with his brother shall be liable to judgment. Whoever insults his brother shall be liable to the council. And whoever says, you fool, and that's a very disrespectful word, shall be liable to the hell of fire, and so on. Later on he says, he who hates his brother is a murderer. Did Jesus say that for the first time? Didn't Moses say in Leviticus 19, you shall not hate your neighbor in your heart? This was not a new idea. It has been in the Bible all along. Take a look at 5:27 on the matter of adultery. You have heard that it was said, you shall not commit adultery. But I say to you that everyone who looks at a woman lustfully has already committed. What about the 10th commandment, which prohibits any evil desire? Hasn't the 10th commandment all along said that you haven't really got the law written in your heart when you just don't break the rules? The law is written in your heart when you don't even want to break the rules. You see, it prohibits evil desire. So the 10 commandments have always taught this, that if you desire this, you're not really keeping the commandments. So Jesus was only reiterating the 10 commandments as originally given. These were not new ideas. And who said what God wants is truth in the inner being? In the 51st Psalm. Didn't David understand this? How about the other writers, Jeremiah and Isaiah, when they said your obedience is just the commandments of men learned by rote. It's just external. Amos says, you keep the Sabbath, but you can hardly wait for the sun to go down so you can cheat with biased scales and so on. Your hearts are not really in it. Remember over and over again we read this? Jesus is saying, I am fully in harmony with the Old Testament. You, my friends, are not. I'm not teaching you anything new. This is as old as the Old Testament. There's no change here whatever. They were not living in harmony with the Scriptures. And of course, this would be very hard to take. Then as you read on, he comes to divorce in 31. It was also said, whoever divorces his wife, let him give her a certificate of divorce. But I say to you that everyone who divorces his wife, except on the ground of unchastity, makes her an adulteress. And whoever marries a divorced woman commits adultery. Oh, that was hard for them to take. And so they brought that up a little later. In 19:3, this is dealt with at some length in a most important way. Let's start with 19:1. Now when Jesus had finished these sayings, he went away from Galilee and entered the region of Judea beyond the Jordan, and large crowds followed him, and he healed them there. And Pharisees, now remember who the Pharisees are. These are the real conservative, Bible-believing teachers of the people. These, I remember Rabbi Simmons telling me not to underestimate the Pharisees. I think the Pharisees were the most like a really careful Adventist. He wants to do the right and proper thing. The Pharisees came up to him and tested him, which they did on several occasions by asking, is it lawful to divorce one's wife for any cause? And he answered, and I very much like this reply, because every once in a while when I do what Jesus did, someone will say, why don't you just answer the question? Why do you have to trace the whole great controversy first? Well, that's true. I do that. But I love the way he did it. Every once in a while he'd say, the only way I can handle that question is to go back to the beginning, which takes a little time, which he did. He says, have you not read that he who made them from the beginning made them male and female? And way back then, he said, Jesus said, for this reason a man shall leave his father and mother and be joined to his wife, and the two shall become one. So they are no longer two, but one. What therefore God has joined together, let no man put asunder. And at a wedding, those are very serious words. I always use them if I have the privilege of conducting a wedding. And whenever I speak those words, I don't know why they're particularly moving. Jesus said this himself. Whatever God has joined together, let no man put asunder. So they said to him, all right, why then did Moses command one to give a certificate of divorce and to put her away? Haven't we got you there? Is that not in the Bible? We have key texts for it. Moses did that, and if you'll go back and read at the end of these laws, it says, these are the laws that God gave Moses and Moses gave the people. So they thought they had him there. And Jesus said to them, yes, I'm not going to say that my father and I, through Moses, did not give you permission to divorce your wives. But do you know why? For your hardness of heart, Moses allowed you to divorce your wives. But from the beginning, it was not so. And I say to you, whoever divorces his wife except for unchastity and marries another commits adultery. And even the disciples were stunned by this. And the disciples said to him, if such is the case of a man with his wife, it is not expedient to marry. That is, if we have to commit ourselves to these women for the rest of our lives, you mean you never can get out of this? It would be best not to marry. I mean, that's too great a commitment. They couldn't understand. He says, well, maybe you can't take it. He said to them, not all men can receive this precept, but only those to whom it is given. And then he made this interesting comment. For there are eunuchs who've been so from birth, and there are eunuchs who've been made eunuchs by man, and there are eunuchs who've made themselves eunuchs for the sake of the kingdom of heaven. He who's able to receive this, let him receive it. Not all are able to make that commitment, but the ideal from the beginning was like this. But look at the lesson in there. He says, not only the divorce laws, but a lot of other things that I gave you in the Old Testament are not evidence of approval. It's just as far as I was able to lead you at the time. And because of the stiffness of your necks and the hardness of your hearts, I permitted you to divorce. Remember Malachi? I hate divorce. Remember in Malachi? I don't like it. And even if it's for a legal reason. It's always a very difficult situation. There is no nice, clean, easy way out of a divorce. There never is a clear way to handle it afterwards, because the whole thing is an emergency that was not supposed to happen. So the provision for divorce on any ground, it was not supposed to happen. I mean, infidelity was not supposed to happen. So if we have difficulty with divorce laws, of course, they are an emergency measure. The ideal is that the situation would never prevail. It would call for divorce, and the two would remain one forever. That's what God intended. Now, what do you think of his giving them permission to eat the food of Egypt? He offered them angels' food, and they said, we cannot stand this worthless stuff. But he didn't say, well, but that's all you get. No, he said, if you insist, you may have the food of Egypt, but may I help you have it? Eat this, not that. It'll be better for you. And they said, good, we can eat this. The Lord recommends it. No, the Lord says, if you don't want angels' food, if you must have this, then be careful when you eat it. They asked for a king. They begged for a king. He said, it'll cause you lots of trouble. He'll conscript your youths, and he'll tax you heavily, as indeed they did. Wouldn't you rather have me for your king? They said, we want to be like the nations round about. They can't see you. We'd like a king. God didn't say, you don't get a king. Either I'm your king or you don't have one. He picked out Saul, taller than anybody, a wonderful man, humble at the beginning, even gave him a new heart. It wasn't his fault that Saul wound up consulting the dead in behalf of the living. God gave them a magnificent man. You think of all the other things they asked for, and he let them. He didn't want them to fight. It never was his intention that they fight their way into Canaan, but they felt safer with soldiers and an army and sentries at night. And God said, well, if you must fight, let me help you fight. You fight well. You get organized here. And they said, good, the Lord endorses fighting. He endorses divorce. He endorses monarchies. He endorses the food of Egypt. He didn't endorse one of them. Every one of those was God simply stooping to meet the people where they are. He could not lead them any faster than they were able to follow. And his condescensions must not be misunderstood for endorsements at all. He looks good in his willingness to allow people to do these things. So now here comes Jesus in person, the one who gave them the divorce law, the one who gave them the food that they wanted and advised them to eat it with care, the one who gave them King Saul, the one who led them in battle, is now here to explain. What an opportunity. And he starts to explain. They didn't like it, and they killed him to silence his explanation. Now, when we get over to John, I hope we can remember maybe where we are tonight. Jesus said some things, I believe, to this day have not really been accepted generally. The last thing he said to the 12 was, there is no need for me to intercede with the Father for you, for the Father loves you himself. Believe that? And yet we go on teaching that he's up there interceding with the Father. He says, I don't have to do it, for the Father loves you as much as I do. In John 3 and John 12, he says, actually, there's no need for me to judge you. Oh, there'll be a judge. The word that I brought will be your judge in the last day. Do we believe that? You see, so have we liked his explanations? I wouldn't want to miss a one of them. To think that after reading the 39 books, we now have the author of the 39, the one who inspired some of our fellow believers and some wonderful friends like Moses to write this down. And we've had questions as we've gone along, and we've attempted explanations. Now here we have the Son of God in person, the one who gave the 10 Commandments on Mount Sinai, saying, may I explain the Old Testament to you? And they didn't like his explanations. In fact, when he was alone with the 12 offering explanation, they were more concerned with the positions they would hold in the kingdom. Even in the upper room the night before he died. And they'd never asked him about any of these things. And a lot of people haven't from that day to this. And I think the time has come to really see if the Bible explains all these matters in the Old Testament. Why the killing? Why the descriptions of an ever-burning hell? Is that really the meaning of Scripture? Has this been answered? Does God say, love me or I'll kill you? Has that been explained? In the day you eat thereof, you shall die. Has that been explained? Has anybody died that death? Why, it was Jesus himself who died that death. So we go to watch him die. Is there an explanation? Did God kill his son? This is what we're really looking for, aren't we? to find out what God is really like. And on the basis of these explanations, would we be able to stand with Moses at the foot of Sinai and hear God raise his voice and shake the ground with an earthquake, and there's fire and lightning and thunder? Could we stand with Moses and understand as Moses did and say, yes, that's God speaking, but don't misunderstand, there is no need to be afraid? See, Moses understood, and he said, remember when we read it in Exodus? There is no need to be afraid. See, he knew why God was raising his voice. He had to. The people were so hard of hearing. Do we accept these explanations? Could we stand with Job and hear those three friends explain and realize that they were wrong? Would we agree with him? I find to this day people saying, look how Job needed to repent at the end of the book. Shame on them. When God came into the scene, he said, Job has said of me what is right. Why don't we look at that compliment and then go back through and say, how could it be said that Job said of the Father what is right? So we have an opportunity now, Mark, Luke, John, to look at Jesus' explanations. And the most important ones are not his words, but the things that he did. For that's evidence. Though not to minimize the words, blessed are the poor. The fact he'd say such a thing, how stunning. And the fact that that was seen to be unbiblical by those Bible-believing, tithe-paying, health-reforming Adventists as a lesson in it for us today. If the Lord were to appear now and explain some things, are we sure we would like what he had to say? Do you want to pick one? I've done all of them tonight. Now, there are many left over, and I thought what we would do with Mark next time is take time for Matthew, and so many are repeated in Mark, Luke, and John. By the time we get to the end of John, we should have covered most of the highlights. What do you suggest for Crucifixion Week, which is the greatest revelation of the truth about God that the universe will ever see? Should we do it at the end of Mark, Luke, or John? It reads the same almost in all four. Would it be well, say, at the end of John to do that, so we could use the details in all four? And if you have a harmony of the four Gospels, that would be the time to bring it. For example, when he was offered something to drink, did he take it or not? You need all four. There was one drink he took, the other one he turned down. And these little details are very interesting to compare. Which Gospel speaks of the bloody sweat that appeared, the piercing of his side, and the blood and water came out, and so on? If you have a harmony, bring it especially when we do John. And that could be one of our most significant evenings together. Maybe since it's 9, can I mention just one to close that impresses me so much out of my whole list? Isn't it in Matthew we have one of the tellings of the story of Mary anointing his feet at the supper? Now, we want to know what God is like after reading the 39 books. And Simon, who was a leper that Jesus had healed, through a dinner. And Lazarus was invited, and his sisters, Mary and Martha. Now, we really need Luke to get some of the details here. Luke says that this Mary was known as a sinful woman, a wicked woman in the town. And during the supper, Mary takes this costly box of ointment and begins to anoint Christ's feet. You wonder how she could be under the table doing this. And once again, we need to be reminded of circumstances those days. If you look at that famous picture of the upper room by Leonardo da Vinci, they're all sitting on mid-Victorian chairs around the table, and you wonder how Mary could be under there finding the right feet, which of course doesn't make any sense. I always never liked the picture of John, always with his head on Jesus' bosom. And as a boy, I thought he must have been a bit of a sissy. And then I read that he was a son of thunder and wondered what had happened to him. He was no sissy, not John. The thing is that when you reclined at the table, your feet would be sticking out all around, beautifully available for a servant to come and wash the feet. Well, the person to your right, who coveted the privilege of being next to you, that's where his head would be, where your chest is, you see, and that's all. So the son of thunder was there with his head next to Jesus. And John was no sissy. But the feet were out there. for Mary to find, and she must have overlooked the fact that the ointment would smell as strong as it did, and the house was filled with the fragrance, and she was exposed. And Simon said, if Jesus were a prophet, he would know what kind of woman this is, and he would not let her touch him. That is, even though Simon had been healed by Jesus, his picture of God was of such a person that God would not let a sinner touch his feet. See? And Jesus, knowing what he was thinking, said, Simon, I have something to say to you. And Simon said, well, tell me. And Jesus told the story of the two debtors. And as he told it, Simon realized that Jesus had read his thoughts. And Simon must have been momentarily terrified because he did not have a good picture of God, did he? He had a God who wouldn't let a sinful woman touch him. Now, realize the predicament Simon was in. In Desire of Ages, it says that Simon is the one who led this woman into sin. But more than that, Signs of the Times, Ellen White says that this woman, who was known as a wicked woman in the town, was Simon's niece. It was her uncle who had led her into this kind of sin. More than that, Ellen White says in Signs of the Times, another article, that this woman was Mary, the woman taken in adultery. Same woman. And knowing that she had this reputation and this tendency, the rascals who wanted to trap her, and John 8's going to tell this, knew that she'd be a good candidate, so they chose her. And they caught her in the act and brought her to Jesus. You remember that story in John 7:53 to 8:11. But now look at the scene. Here is Simon, the prosperous businessman, presiding over this feast. And he realizes that Jesus knows the whole thing. That he, who led his niece here into sin, has been thinking in his heart, if Jesus knew what kind of a girl this is, and do I know what kind of a girl she is, he would not let her touch him. Now, the Jews would not think well of this kind of thing, that an uncle would lead his niece into sin. And so he must have held his breath. At any minute now, when Jesus finishes that story of the two debtors, he's going to say, now let me give you the moral of these stories. I have something to say about our host. You see this man who's been presiding so piously over this feast? You know this woman here, you all know her, don't you? Known as a wicked woman in the town. Now, I love what she's done, and I know why she did it. It's a very beautiful thing. And Ellen White says if Christ had not accepted this, he would have crushed her spirit, because she didn't have much self-respect. She knew what her reputation was, and because Jesus courteously accepted her impulsive act meant a great deal to Mary. You know he'd do that kind of thing. And he could have said, do you know who's responsible for this woman having this reputation? This pious fraud at the head of the table. This would have ruined Simon for the rest of his life, wouldn't it? Absolutely ruined. Now, why didn't Jesus expose him? He surely deserved to be exposed. I thought you were supposed to call sin by its right name and all those other good things. Simon got the message, didn't he? Did anybody else need to get it? Does God have any pleasure in embarrassing his children? Does it do any good to do so? He no more embarrassed Simon than he embarrassed those rascals who brought the woman taken in adultery, the same Mary. Remember, he wrote their sins in the dust, and a few footsteps and a few puffs of wind, and the record was gone. He did not expose them. They came and looked, and they left. I mean, what a revelation this is of God. He does not enjoy humiliating his children. And Desire of Ages says that Simon became one of Christ's most devoted followers, and what won him was the incredible revelation that the God he thought wouldn't let this woman touch his feet. That instead God was the kind of person who wouldn't even expose a sinner who deserved to be exposed. And it really won him that God did not expose Simon before his friends. Now, that's marvelous good news. So you see, when we meet God in the hereafter and realize that he knows all about us, as Jesus knew all about Simon, and none of us has that good a record. Some of us have worse ones than others. Do we need to fear how Jesus will treat us in the hereafter? If he would treat Simon that way, even people who couldn't be saved and did not become his followers. Look at those Pharisees who brought that poor woman. Look how he treated them. How did he treat Judas? You remember when Judas went to betray his Lord? Jesus had so covered for him that the other disciples thought he'd gone to make an offering to feed the poor. That's how Jesus covered for Judas. And there are many more stories like this. This is the clearest evidence the universe will ever see or ever need as to the kind of person our God is. And what I like is it's not so much in words as it is a description. It's stories. That's why it's such a shame to collect the key text, the statements, and skip the stories. We say, well, the stories are for the children. The stories are the evidence. The recounting of the story of the woman taken in adultery, the story in the upper room, and the story here of the woman who anointed his feet. It's the story that is such compelling evidence. And based on that evidence, we have the statements that God is love, and so on. That statement, God is love, doesn't mean too much apart from stories like this. Love covers a multitude of sins, and so on, it says. Well, watch him do it. We can count on it. In the hereafter, we have no need to fear the infinite memory of God. However, it does also mean that no one could be safely admitted to the hereafter who could not be entrusted with a memory of other people's sins and treat them with all due respect. Because someday we run into Rahab. Can you see some people saying, hey, I've been wanting to meet you for a long time. Hey, what was it like before you straightened out your life? You know, she was a prostitute once. Can you see how we could make people uncomfortable in the hereafter? Or rubbing David's sins into him. You know, you can just see David and Uriah and Bathsheba and Solomon meeting. You know that's a collision. Because by the time the introductions are over, everybody's going to know who everybody is. There's no other way you can do that without letting, maybe we don't know who anybody is in the hereafter. Of course we know who everyone is. And we're made up of our lives. And Uriah is going to find out that remarkable boy was not his son, but was David's son. That's going to be very, very awkward. And so truly God cannot save anyone who cannot be entrusted with a memory of other people's sins, and who in spite of all that will not treat or will treat fellow sinners with all due dignity and respect as God has done himself. So we have 3 more Monday nights for the Gospels. This is the heart of the whole thing. And the rest of the New Testament is based on this. Paul's explanations are all based on these incredible pictures of God. I much prefer these, by the way, to the stories I read from the Apocrypha. I hope no one, maybe being very tired, woke up from time to time in the middle of those stories. That was apocryphal. I mean, the first 2/3 was in the Apocrypha. I mean, don't be like the person in the Apocryphal Old Testament who's described as the fool. You remember? The fool is as one that sleepeth, and when it is all over, he saith, what was it? So I hope no one is like that and will think that some of those stories are true. We were in the Apocryphal Old Testament, the pseudepigraphical Old Testament, and the Apocryphal New Testament. And then we looked at these accumulated rules of the devout Jews who really wanted to obey the blueprint. And then we came to the Gospels, where God in person is revealing the truth about himself. Now we must, in Mark, particularly next time, note Jesus' observance of the Sabbath and the trouble he got into when he allowed them to eat on the Sabbath in a certain way, and he healed on the Sabbath. Why did he get into trouble? Remember the rules in the Mishnah. He was breaking those rules. But he said, I never gave you those rules. These are commandments of men learned by rote. Quoting Isaiah. Our loving Father in heaven, we realize that in many and various ways thou hast revealed the truth to us about thyself. We surely have no reason to undervalue the books of the Old Testament. We see the same God with the same goals, the same purposes from the very beginning. Clearly all thou hast asked of us is trust, and there's every reason to trust thee. But now as we come to the New Testament, to think that God himself would come in person in such a humble way, we realize thou art infinite in majesty and power, that thou didst forbid Moses to see thee in thy glory because we sinners cannot see thee in thy glory and live. No wonder then Jesus had to veil the dazzling splendor of his divinity, that we humans might come to know God without being consumed. But how sad that thine own chosen people living in Jerusalem, in the promised land, the children of Abraham who'd grown up with all 39 books and had read the wonderful pictures of thee in Isaiah and Jeremiah and Amos and Hosea and Micah and in the Psalms and in the teachings of Moses, did not recognize thee when thou wast walking here among us, being so gracious, feeding people, healing people, even crying at the funeral of one of thy friends, and setting us free from so many burdensome rules and regulations that not only made no sense, but put thy Father in such a bad light. Forbid that we should make the same mistake today. Help us to be sure that every time we set out to do thy will, it really is thy will. And we see how necessary it is that even when thou hast told us to do something, that we seek to understand what it is thou hast asked us to do, that we may do it intelligently. For surely when we obey thy will intelligently, we find that everything thou hast asked us to do makes such good sense, we should want to do it anyway without being told. What a shame that thou didst have to stoop and tell us not to hate and kill and steal and be immoral. How far we must have sunk to have our Father speak to us this way. We love the emphasis of Jesus, that truly to even want to do these things means we've not yet been fully healed, but that he offers us complete healing, where we'll not only just obey the rules, but even come to the place where we do what's right because we agree it's right and we want to do it. So we thank thee for the confirmation of the teachings of the Old Testament that we find in the life and teachings of Jesus himself. Do bless us these next few Monday evenings especially, that we miss nothing from what he came to reveal. We thank thee for it and long for the day when we actually may be like him ourselves. We pray in his name.